let's talk about the inverse property. Let's talk about the inverse property and think about it. The inverse property really has to do with opposites. When you think inverse, think opposite. Think opposite, reciprocal, that type of thing. Those words should come to your mind when you think inverse. And the inverse property simply says that if you have a number like A, if you have A plus negative A, you're going to get 0. So it's going to be the inverse of it. So it's a property related to multiplication and addition. So if you have A plus a negative A is going to be equal to 0, which we'll talk about in a minute. And if you have A times 1 over A, then the answer is just going to be 1. So let's talk about that and dive into that just a minute for just a second. So let's look at the addition part of this. And this is going to make a lot of sense to you, right? So if I have A, let's have a number. Say I have $9, if you will. If I add a negative 9 to that, I'm going to be at 0. So if I start at 9, I add a negative 9, I'm going to be right at 0. And if you think about subtraction, subtraction is really adding the opposite. So when you think about the inverse operation or the inverse property when it comes to addition, and basically what it says is that if you have a number and you add its opposite, you're going to be at 0. And that's really what subtraction is. And as you get higher and higher in math, you want to think about subtraction as just the opposite of adding a negative, adding an opposite. So if I had $9, say you had $9 in your bank, and that was an item in the ledger, if you will, in your bank account, and then you paid $9 to somebody, you had to make another item, you had to add another item that said you took away $9, would you be at 0? You had $9 in, and you had to add another item that said you took away $9, you'd be at 0. So that's what the inverse operation is when it comes to addition, right? So let's think about the inverse property as it relates to multiplication. What about multiplication? When it comes to multiplication, let's say you have a number A, or like the number 7. If I multiply 7 times 1 over 7, I'm going to be at 1. And it's going to be better for us to take a look at this a little bit in terms of this example right here. So let's say I have the number 7, and I'm going to go ahead and multiply that times 1 over 7. Well, it's going to be equal to 7. This 7 right here, whenever you have a 7, if you will, or a number, it's going to be the same thing as if it's a 7 over 1. It's just like it's 7 over 1. So anytime you have an integer like that and it's by itself, you can automatically assume that there's an imaginary 1 underneath. We just don't write it because it's going to be equal to 7 anyway, right? So we really don't write it because it's going to be equal to 7. But what you're doing is, if you're going to go ahead and multiply this 7 times 1 over 7, and it's going to be equal to 1, which it's going to be equal to 7 over 7. It's going to be equal to the same thing, because 7 times 1 is going to give you 7. This imaginary 1 right here is going to be 1 times 7, which is going to give you 7. You end up with 7 over 7, and that's just equal to 1. So any number that's multiplied by its inverse, 1 over its inverse, 1 over itself, is going to be equal to 1, and that's why it's equal to 1. Now, something else to think about when you think about multiplication, you think about what addition is or division and multiplication. Let's say I had a number like this. Let's say I had 8 over 7. What really is that? If I had 8 over 7, 8 over 7 is really the same thing as 8 with this imaginary 1 here times 1 over 7. That's really what that is. That's the same thing. That equals 8 over 7. So when you think about it, division is really defined as multiplying by a reciprocal, multiplying by some type of reciprocal. So this right here is 8 times the reciprocal of 7, 1 over 7. So when you think about inverse, you think about opposites, this is a good way to think about opposites. And if you need to rewind this video and take a look at this a couple of times, that would be great. But I wanted to show you a little bit about the inverse property when it comes to real numbers. Talk to you soon.